everybody, and welcome to another episode of React Native Radio. This week, again, I'm filling in for the panel. I'm Charles Max Wood, and we have a special guest, and it's Anna. Okay, let me see if I can do this. Doubkovar.
Nearly, Doubkovar.
Doubkovar.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Infinite Red is a US-based consultancy specializing in React and React Native. They do mobile app and web design and development. They are deeply involved in the React and React Native open source communities, publish the React Native newsletter with 10,000 subscribers, and are involved with the React Native core development. If you have a project and need design or engineering help from an experienced team to take it all the way from concept to completion, get in touch with Infinite Red. Also check out Chain React, the React Native conference, which is hosted by Infinite Red in July in Portland with 500 developers from all around the world. You can find them at infinite.red. Make sure to mention you heard about them in this ad.
Awesome. Do you want to just let people know who you are and what you've done, why you're famous, all that stuff?
Sure. So I am a developer. I'm mainly React Native dev at the moment. Mm-hmm. I work for a company here in London called Hive, and we do smart homes, devices, that kind of stuff. And we have decided to rebuild our native applications in React Native around a year and a half ago, and finally released it last winter. And it's been quite a successful project, and we're all quite excited about React Native in general. Plus, I've been doing some talks over the last few years on various topics, and the last year mainly it has been React Native.
Nice. Yeah, so I think I've seen Hive devices at the hardware store for like sprinkler systems and stuff. Is that what we're talking about?
Well, I think mainly the thing that we do is thermostats and light bulbs, but we do have all kinds of like security stuff as well. That there's like a huge range. Oh
yeah. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff. If you just do a quick Google search for Hive Smart Home, yeah, there's a bunch.
Yeah. So that poses like a big problem when you're developing a React Native app like that. It's easy to do like a hello world, but when you start doing something that has to handle, I don't know, like 15 different or 20 different kinds of devices, and their schedules and actions and how they link to each other, suddenly you have a huge app, and just the scale of it is suddenly a bit of a problem.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that a lot of mobile apps, it just works on your phone when you're using it. But when it's something like home automation, then it's, oh crap, why didn't my thing turn on? Why isn't my camera doing what it's supposed to? Or why isn't my, doorbell or, thermostat or whatever? Yeah. And if it doesn't work, people know.
Exactly. And it's especially bad with thermostats, like you have responsibility that those people won't freeze to death or, like die of heat. So we have to be very careful in the release process that we do not to break anything.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely don't want to break anything. So did you inherit React Native apps when you started working there, or, did you come on right when they were switching?
So actually I started working at Hive as a React web developer first, and then all of us web developers were moved on to the React Native project once it went out from its prototype phase. So I would say that we have been there pretty much from the start. And the first thing that we tried to do was actually take all of the code that we wrote for the web app, because it was React, and try to reuse it in React Native. Right.
That's really interesting, because I hear people talk, and I'm just going to we're going to work our way into, what we were talking about at the beginning of the show. But it's interesting to me because I've talked to a lot of people, and kind of the pipe dream, I guess, for React to React Native is that you get to reuse all that code. And then what I find as I talk to people is that they get into building a React Native app, and yeah, there's some stuff they can reuse, but for the most part, they can't. And so I'm wondering, how much reusability did you get out of the move to React Native?
You're absolutely right. Like, we had this idea that we could reuse everything, then you realize you can't reuse components, and then you realize styles are only partially reusable. So the main thing that you can reuse is state handling, and that's still really useful because it's not just about developing the code, it's also about making sure it actually works,
Right.
So the QA part of it is also very important. So the fact that we know how the business logic works, that it does work the way we coded it, saved us a lot of time. having said that, we are more moving towards using React Native Web now, because that allows you to reuse everything, or well, rather write everything just once.
Oh, interesting. And how does React Native Web work for you? Because I've also heard some mixed reviews about that. Some people love it and some people don't.
Well, it is the easiest way around it. I think if you are willing to have a slightly, well, I don't know how to put this, but like the website that it creates isn't perfect, because it looks a little bit like tablet even when it's on a big screen, which is something we probably could work with, but it's too much work, so we don't actually.
Right.
You have to build some of like custom components yourself, so it's not 100%, like you run a script and suddenly you have a website. It doesn't work that easily, but it's still by far the easiest way of making sure that your web apps and your mobile apps are the same, including the same copy, the same designs, etc.
Yeah, it makes sense. So you're building React Native apps. Where did you start? Because it sounds like you already had mobile apps. So
right. So we did have a mobile app, but then to cut costs mainly, we've decided to try out React Native. So we built a prototype first to check that it will be able to handle everything we need to handle. Since we have devices like a camera that you can actually speak through using your phone, we had to make sure that all of this stuff like streaming and I don't know, like all the different hardware connections would actually work. So we first started with a prototype like that, and that was actually done by people who have had experience with React Native before. But after that, they just asked all of the web developers to come on board. So we all kind of became React Native developers overnight.
Nice. So did you take a class then to make that transition, or?
No, one day I came to work and someone showed me how to build the React Native app. They told me that views are the new divs, and that was it. And we started rolling, because it's actually so similar that you don't need much more than that.
Nice. So you get in, you start doing React Native. What was kind of the hardest thing to transition to, given that you've done React in the past?
I think the hardest thing was the fact that developing for mobile platform is more difficult in the sense that you suddenly have all the native errors you have to deal with that you probably don't understand. I didn't, for sure. You have to build stuff. It's no longer just transpiling code to make it more understandable for a browser. It's suddenly you actually have to compile something, and that takes ages. You make a change in something, and then you wait for 15 minutes to get a new build. So the cycle itself of development is so much slower and so much more frustrating when something goes wrong.
Yeah, it's funny because I built Java apps and C++ apps and stuff in college, and you're talking about this. And I'm like, oh yeah, some people compile their code, right?
Yeah. It's easy to forget, and it's quite funny how when you're a web developer you tend to complain a lot. I think we all kind of complain about the tools we use a lot because they can become frustrating, but you sometimes forget how easy you have it, with like hot module reloading and the fact that something compiles in just 20 seconds. It's incredible. Then you go into React Native and you suddenly appreciate how much faster it is and how much better the tooling is when you're developing web apps.
Oh yeah, that's always interesting too. I mean, you get into, I've done some stuff with Swift, and that's not my favorite tool chain. I didn't really love Xcode, and the Android tools aren't really terrific either. But then you get to some of these JavaScript IDEs and it's like, wow, there's a lot here. And a lot of people are building new stuff for React Native that just make it a lot easier to deal with. And then it works on both platforms anyway. So there's a lot going for it that way.
Yeah, for sure. Although having said that, you can't actually avoid completely using Xcode and Android Studio, especially when you get into more of the sort of nitty-gritty stuff. You still have to use that. And you really do feel the pain, especially with Xcode. Apple are so good at developing great phones and laptops, but their IDE sucks. Sorry, Apple developers.
It's so true. It's like, wait, developers built this and they use it themselves?
Yeah, it feels like, they kind of hated the end users. Yeah. Having said that, it does actually look quite a lot like it was made by developers, because it is like, the UX isn't very straightforward, and just figuring out where to update like paths for libraries or something like that, it's not straightforward.
Yeah. So before the call, we were talking about performance and making your app more performant. And I'm curious a little bit, because one thing that I found is that a lot of developers obsess over performance, and they don't actually need to obsess over performance, if that makes sense, right? It's fast enough. Nobody really feels like it's slowed down for them or anything. And since you're running a React Native app on your phone, it's not like there's any latency or anything over the internet unless you're going and asking for data off of a server. So what kind of performance metrics are you looking at, and where do you find that they really matter?
This is like what you just said is so true, because I find that like when developers are talking about performance, it's usually a very theoretical discussion. Like using this library is unperformant, the kind of thing we like to say when we argue what is better or worse. But I find that when you start doing metrics, that this whole other world opens up, and it's a world of huge uncertainty. We realized, for example, that our app was very slow when transitioning from one state to another, from one screen to another. And we couldn't quite figure out why. And till today, we're still struggling to understand the details of it. And it was quite a lot of different things. But the JavaScript thread was completely bogged with all kinds of stuff happening. And then we realized a lot of re-renders are happening, and that we should probably stop that. And then we realized that a lot of the re-renders were happening because of a pattern we started using, because we assumed it was more performant. That's the ultimate irony. And from that time on, I realized, maybe we should stop saying this is more performant in general ways. We have to talk about how is this as a pattern performant, and we have to really start thinking about not only the pattern itself, but the implementation overall, and whether it makes sense for that particular case.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So now, are you testing things when you make changes to say, okay, it's now more performant or less performant, or how do you manage that so you don't make another misstep like this where it's, oh, we're going to make it more performant, and then you go back and you realize didn't really work?
I think the ultimate answer is we don't measure. We should, but we just don't have the resources. And I think that's part of the problem. In order to really do proper measurements, you need to have special builds, and you need to test it on specific devices. And you have to be just devising a way of making sure that something is faster or slower than it was before is so unbelievably difficult, because any change will just very likely be marginal in terms of performance. So it's something that incrementally creeps up on you. So we did a lot of changes over the first half of this year, and our users are really happy with them. But we know from our measurements that maybe half of what we did actually helped. The other half is just their perception. Maybe they got used to it. So that's why I said, like, it's a world of huge uncertainty. You do a measurement on a new iPhone and something you did is slower. You do it on an old Android and it's much faster. And it's hard to say this is more performant. You can say this is probably more performant most of the time on a specific device.
That's true. That's very true. It's something that, I hadn't really considered, but that makes sense. So what kinds of performance upgrades are you looking at making then to your React Native apps? I mean, where's the low-hanging fruit for most people?
Well, re-renders, 100%. That is specific to any app out there. It's not just React Native. I think
that's true on the web. It's also true on a lot of desktop systems. I mean, that's almost universally true. If it's going to draw on the screen, it re-renders is going to take up time and resources.
Yeah, exactly. The thing that we learned the hard way was that most people, and even the React docs, tell you that you should component update to make sure that you don't re-render too often.
Okay.
But that's actually making things a little bit harder, because then things don't update when you expect them to. When you make a change or something, when you have nested views, it suddenly should component update becomes more of a problem than a solution. So we ended up not using it practically anywhere at all. And instead, we really had to look into how React reconciles components, how the whole update cycle works, and make sure that we leverage the way React itself works, not to re-render too much.
Right.
But I don't think that's entirely a low-hanging fruit. I would say it's the key thing. Like if your app is slow, that's the one thing to definitely look into. It's quite easy as well, because the React Native Devs tools or the Chrome debugger, they are both very good at showing you what your JavaScript is doing. So you can spot that easily. You can fix that by not knowing that much. You just need to figure out, how the props or state are updating the UI. But it's difficult, because in every component, in every screen, you might have made the same mistake like we did. And then you might need to rewrite a lot of your code, and that's a lot of refactoring. Having said that, there are easier things that are sort of out of the box, especially for React Native. There is the RAM bundler, which you can pretty much just like switch on. There's like really like nicely written documentation for that. You can do inline requires, meaning that all of your imports get sort of transpiled into inline requires. So a lot of the code won't get pulled in and ran to begin with. So the startup time is faster. There's also something that I've been working on recently, and I'm hoping to one day get into the React Native CLI, and that is the way we package native modules should be actually completely different to what we do now. But that's more like a cutting edge thing at the moment.
Yep. Cool. Now, are you using, because I've heard that there are some performance benefits, and I've also heard there are some performance drawbacks to using things like out of CocoaPods or, other native libraries. Have you looked at that at all, or?
Well, not really. And the reason behind that is mainly that we don't actually find on iOS the startup performance to be an issue.
Right.
On iOS in general, our app starts quite fast. And I think that's due to the fact that Apple device or iOS devices have a very smart way of pulling in code, which Android doesn't. So in Android, it's much more of an issue. So that's something we were looking into a lot. Mm-hmm. But that's mainly around how you initialize and load native modules and using separate threads to do that. So it's a lot of sort of like very detailed, rather uninteresting work, I'd say.
Right. That makes sense. So when you're looking for performance issues, then do you typically then just fiddle with the app and see where it feels slow, or what's your approach to identifying the next thing to work on?
Well, you just look into reviews and you find all the 1-star ones, and people are very happy to tell you everything that is wrong with it.
Welcome to the internet.
It's like it's incredible, like when we released our app, we had some absolutely unbelievable scathing reviews. As a web developer, you're not used to it because people don't have a place where they can complain about what you have made. But in native apps, suddenly, you've got all of these people telling you that the developers should be fired and that this is like, an absolute trash. That's literally what people were like writing in the reviews. I was like, oh my God, this, do they realize we're human beings?
Well, people don't think about that. It's the internet.
Yeah, that is true. Like it's like, the developers are like some, I don't know, people who are not people. I don't understand it. But anyway, yeah, users are very happy to report everything that is wrong. So that's how we could determine, like you don't know who the user is, who the app is slow for, but you can tell, like what device they're using, for example. So that sort of gives you handy pointers. And vast majority of the time, the issue has always been startup time, because that is the hardest thing to crack, really.
Yeah. Yeah, but it sounds like you didn't have that problem on iOS, just on Android. Is there a way that you identify those issues for one platform versus the other?
I suppose so. I mean, we have like a huge team of QAs, so they sort of, spend a lot of time with the app, and they report it back to us. But also, as we are developing, you kind of like, see as you're working that things are, not working as you would like them to.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
And also, generally, it's always the slow Android phones, like the old Android phones, that are the biggest problem. So
that makes sense, though. They don't have as many resources to run on.
Yeah, exactly. So all developers in our team just, got one of those to run the app on from time to time to check that what we're doing actually isn't absolutely awful there.
This episode is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume, you spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/reactradio. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus. So what kind of performance gains did you get by taking care of some of the re-renders and other things?
So from the re-rendering side of things, you could visibly start seeing it being so much better, so much faster. Especially we had, like, for example, like a light bulb picker where you can select a temperature of your light or a color of your light. It's sort of like this like round swiper. And originally you could see like it being like staggered movement. But when we fixed the re-rendering, you could see it being suddenly really smooth. So we didn't actually measure this with, like data and numbers. We just looked at it and thought, is this good enough? Will our users feel that this is like a good experience? So that's the main stuff. But when it comes to startup time, that's something you already have to measure. And on like the oldest Android phones, we managed to cut it down by maybe 5 to 10 seconds, which is, I think, is quite good. It still takes time, but it's now at least, it doesn't take that long that you'd need to go make yourself a cup of tea before you can start using the app.
Yeah, very cool. I'm not really sure where to go from here. Are there other approaches that you're taking to make your app better?
Well, in terms of performance, not really. I think, performance is important from user perspective. But I think at the end of the day, people also get used to a lot of stuff. And I think our advantage is that the app is like a practical tool. It's not something that you do for fun or to kill time. It's something that you use because you practically want to or have to. Mm-hmm. So I find that users kind of get used to a lot. Having said that, for us to be competitive with other companies, we need to make sure the experience of it is still good. But like performance-wise, I feel like we have arrived at a point which is okay. And now we're mainly focusing on making sure that the UX and the UI are good. Looking into accessibility is something that we do a lot of. And just generally revising the user experience for everyone.
Yeah, that makes sense. And accessibility is another one that I hadn't really thought about. I know that iOS has a very robust accessibility system. I haven't really looked at Android's. But yeah, that's interesting as well. Just because, if people have a device, yeah, you want to be able to use your app, even if they, can't use it the same way that most people do. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually find that we do have quite a few users who have like weak sites. They, like it's not that they would be completely unable to use it, but they need like proper contrast. They need to have larger fonts and that kind of stuff. So that's something that we spend actually a lot of time trying to fix, make sure that people can actually use it comfortably, even if they have some difficulties. But we also spend quite a lot of time on doing like voiceover, and that's quite a cool experience when you start learning how to do it, and then you can't get out of that mode because you have no idea, you've never used it before, and you have to use a different phone to Google out how to get out of that mode because you suddenly can't even use it. And it just gives you such a big appreciation for how difficult it is to use badly made apps if you're if you don't see or something like that. So it is quite an interesting dev experience as well. And Android actually has quite a good system as much as iOS, I'd say.
Yeah. So what are you working on adding to the app right now? Is it the accessibility and UX stuff, or are you more focused on other areas?
Well, at the moment, we're rebuilding one part of the app to make it more user-friendly and more accessible, but also make sure that it's a little bit less buggy than it is until now. It's regarding installation journeys, which are super complex because you sometimes have to, connect with Bluetooth to another device and change Wi-Fi settings, etc. So it's like really complex stuff. And we used to have a lot of sort of bugs in that. So we're now looking into using state machines to rebuild that while changing also the UI to make it more accessible.
Very cool. Well, for me, since I'm kind of a new React Native developer, I'm wondering if you have any pointers for me.
For new React Native devs?
Yeah. I have a lot of years of web development experience, and I've played with most of the frameworks. So I have some relevant experience. I don't know which parts of it is. So yeah, are there things that you would tell somebody who's transitioning from the React world to the React Native world that they need to be aware of or keep up on, or things like that?
I would say, and that's from experience of teaching React Native to newbies recently, just try using Expo, or I think it's called Snack.io. There's like a web version of React Native where you can just write React Native code and see it immediately appear. And that's a really nice starting point, because getting React Native app built on your laptop is such a difficult experience. Just downloading Xcode, like the latest version, takes 3 hours. And then, you see a lot of red screens of death before you manage to see anything working. So I would say unless you're really serious about making something, just try Expo or Snack and just see, how it feels, how the development process works. But otherwise, it's so similar. I think it's more of a feeling you feel like you're almost afraid because it's native and it's like a whole different world. But actually, well, at least I felt that way. But actually, at the end of the day, it's exactly the same thing. You write exactly the same JSX. The styles are super similar. Handling business logic, etc. Everything is the same. There's routing. There's actually one pointer. Use React. No, what is it called? There are 3 navigations. They are all called super similar. I think it's called React Navigation, Native Navigation. Shit. Let me Google that out, because that's actually the most useful point I can give anyone starting with React Native. This is the library to use. Just give me a second.
Nice. Yeah, and I'll fill some silence here for a minute. I interviewed Charlie Cheever for JavaScript Jabber. I think it was last week, and we talked about Expo and Snack.io and all the stuff they're doing over there. So yeah, great stuff there. Really, really enjoyed talking to him, and it's just interesting to see how the ecosystem is changing.
Yeah, so I'm 80% sure it's called React Navigation, and that is the thing. Because it's a nice crossover between JavaScript and native, and it's not too native and it is not too JavaScript. So it is performant while it is not too much going against the concept of React itself. So yeah, that is my one pointer.
Nice. All right.
Possibly another thing is that I find a lot of people worrying about animations and the fact that React Native has a reputation of being very slow. But that's something that we didn't find at all. Like if you're doing super complex animations, you can always use Reanimated library and it will work nicely. But yeah, that's something that I wouldn't worry about. I find that a lot of people find that like as a hurdle, but I don't think that it really is.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I've talked to a lot of people. I've talked to people who do Ionic. I've talked to people who do React Native. I've talked to people who use some other Cordova-based system. I've talked to the folks over at NativeScript. And yeah, 5-10 years ago, the performance was a problem. But today, I mean, even the web rendered stuff that runs on Cordova, like Ionic, most people can't tell. They can't tell what it's written in. And that's kind of the nice thing, right? Because then you get to the point where I'm just going to write this in something that I'm comfortable moving around in. I'm happy with where things are. And you can just pull the trigger and do whatever you're going to do. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I still find that things like NativeScript or React Native have the advantage of allowing you to bridge over into native very easily.
Right.
So like if you need to drop down to native, you still can. And I think that's very powerful. Like especially if you want to make like a large scale production ready app, you will probably face an issue where going native really saves you. And we sure did for some components. We actually just had to write them in their native equivalents just to make sure it works well. But yeah, especially for like simple apps, I would just write it with whatever, and it will work.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, I've talked to folks again on the Cordova side, and Cordova even has a lot of stuff that bridges into the native. And so you can get away with it. The main difference is the UI is built in web technologies instead of native technologies.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing. Like if you then need to do something very complex UI wise, that might be a struggle. But let's face it. Like how many times do we actually need to do that?
Yeah.
Most apps probably will never have that issue. And frankly, like I've been chatting to a lot of people from like quite large companies, and a lot of companies decided to switch to React Native or Cordova or something like that, because the truth is we don't need perfect apps. We need apps that are good enough and that don't cost us too much to run.
Right.
Which is a little bit sad. I think we all kind of want to be artisans and build the best thing out there, but the truth is building the best thing out there is very difficult to afford, and even large companies are very happy to not have the perfect thing and instead just have something that works for everyone.
Yep. Makes sense. All right. Well, I'm going to push us over to picks, mainly because I have a call in 15 minutes and I have to be on it. So picks are, if you haven't listened to any of our shows, and I know that, some folks only listen to this show or, whatever, but there are things that you want to just tell the world about, right? Things that are so great that you want to let people know about. So some people tend to stick more to the technology side. So it's like, we're using this library and this other tool. And then other people, they get in and it's like, I've been playing this video game, or I've been watching these movies or this TV show or books or whatever, and really just been enjoying it. So I'll go ahead and start, and you can kind of get the feel for it. One of the things that I'm going to start out picking. So yesterday, I think I watched 5 or 6 hours of soccer. The Women's World Cup was this last week. The final was yesterday as we record this. And I really love watching soccer, especially at the international level, where you've got the top players from the top countries coming and competing. It's just great. And, they've added it to the Olympics. So next year is Olympics, and the year after that is, I think it's the Men's World Cup, and or it might be in 3 years. I don't remember. Anyway, so there's always a major tournament going on, and it's just, I love it. I love being able to watch these teams. Now, I will admit, I tend to follow 3 or 4 countries' teams. I always follow the United States because that's where I live. And we typically, at least on the women's side, have a team that will qualify and do well. The men's side, I don't think they qualified last time. But they made it to the quarterfinals the time before. And so anyway, they're fun to watch too. I lived in Italy for 2 years. And so I always root for the Azzurri. I've got this soft spot in my heart for them. And and so they're fun to watch, especially when they're good. But the last couple World Cups, they really haven't shown up either. The first World Cup, when I got back from Italy, they won. And so that was fun. That was fun to watch them go all the way. Yeah. And then England, and I don't know why England, but England. So, and then they always field the terrific team. So that's always fun to watch too. So, I think the last Men's World Cup, I watched the English team, and then I think I picked some other country just because, so I'd have other games to watch and root for people. But yeah. So yeah, that's one pick. And then the other pick, I have this game that I wasted a bunch of time on, and I still play it here and there. I just check in on it every day. It's called Kingdoms of Heckfire. And I think it's a funny name, but it's one of the games where you go out and you send your army over and, attack monsters, gather resources. You're part of a clan, and, so you can share resources among your clan. And then, you kind of play your way up. So, anyway, I've been enjoying that. I just switched clans. I made my old clan mad. But yeah, so that's kind of been my big time waste. And then, I'm going to start posting videos about it. And I've talked about this on other shows, but the 75 hard. So if you want to go to devchat.tv/YouTube, then you can go check out our YouTube channel. And I'm going to start doing the DevRev again. And I'm going to be talking about 75 hard on there, which is just a program that I've been doing where you work out twice a day, you drink a gallon of water, you stick to your diet, you read 10 pages out of a book, and you post to social media about it. And so anyway,
cool.
Yeah, I kind of summarized it fast because I've already talked about it way too much on the other shows. So, anyway, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. If you blow it, you have to start over. And I have to admit, my sister does show notes for these shows, and she's now 5 days ahead of me on 75 hard. She heard about it, and then we did some family stuff over the weekend for the holiday, and she's like, "So how's your 75 days going?" And I'm like, "I messed up." And she's like, "Well, I'm 4 days in." I'm like, "Yeah." So my goal is to finish before her, but that means she has to screw up, and I'm not rooting for her to screw up, but I still want to finish before her. And so, yeah, I guess the best scenario is I finish 5 days behind her. So there you go. So do you have some picks for us? Yeah, it's fun.
Picks. Wow. I subscribed or signed up for studying psychology remotely from October.
Ooh.
I've always been super interested in psychology, and I did a psychotherapy course here in London, which I absolutely loved. And I just find it fascinating to, read books about not just psychology, but human beings in general, and understand the kind of, what are we doing here? And, how do we figure out how to make the most out of it? So there are a few really inspiring books that I read during the course, and I'm looking forward to more. But the one that I absolutely loved was On Becoming a Person by Carl Rogers. He's one of the sort of main psychologists of the 20th century. I believe he lived in the US most of his life. And he basically talked about the idea that psychology or psychotherapy isn't that necessarily to heal people, but to help people reach their fullest potential. And he that's cool. Yeah, it wasn't that much about, what's wrong with people, but more about how do we make sure that we're all, at our best. And he also talked a little bit about politics, and the fact that, we know that in relationships, usually communication is the problem. If relationships aren't working, it's very much down to the fact that the communication isn't right. And he applied that to, back in his day, to the Cold War conflict. And he said, I'm just, imagining if, American president and president of USSR sat down together and actually talked as two human beings, maybe they would have been able to resolve this as well. So Yeah, that's one person that really like hugely inspired me.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that too, because if you go look at the Cold War, things started to end as far as the Cold War went once Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev actually did sit down in Iceland. So, I don't know how much of the seeing each other as humans went on, and I'm sure there was a bunch of posturing, but yeah, they actually got together and sat down together and understood each other a little bit better. And then things started to, change. So,
yeah, I'm being very hopeful that, like maybe the North Korean US conflict could maybe be resolved through this as well. But yeah, generally, there's like so much stuff going on in the world that could go horribly wrong with like climate change and nuclear weapons and stuff. It's always nice to see when people are trying to come together and actually find some solutions.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting too, though, that if we look at the problems that we have, and I'm not trying to discount them at all, but we've got it pretty good. I think we've got it better than we've ever had it as humans on this planet. So, it's not to say there's not stuff to worry about, but at the same time, I'm pretty optimistic that we can find our way through these issues because I don't see any of these issues that we haven't overcome in some way, very similar things in the past. So,
yeah, you're absolutely right. Like it's probably not, like doom and gloom. Like we're quite a crafty species and we'll figure it out, which is great. As you said, like there's this question, like if you could be born in any other time than right now as you, if you would choose a different time, I haven't heard a single person say that they would choose different time than now.
No, I mean, I'm sure it gets better in the future, but we don't know that either.
Yeah. Hopefully.
Yep. Well, cool. Well, thanks for coming and talking to me about React Native. Hopefully we can start pulling the panel back together and getting things going here. But yeah, it's been fun just to kind of catch up and see where things are at with React Native and get a feel for what you're working on. Yeah,
thanks for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, one thing that I usually ask, and I should have asked this earlier in the show, is if people want to find you online, where do they find you? I'm assuming Twitter and GitHub, but are there other places too? And where do they find you on there?
No, I think Twitter is definitely the easiest one. But my handle is a little bit weird. It's a Lithin with a double N at the end, so that's a tricky one.
Is there a story behind that handle?
You know what? I think it might have something to do with World of Warcraft character.
I love it.
So yeah, I think it was something like that, but it's been with me like most of my life, and I just sort of gave up on changing it. That's kind of what it is.
Nerd.
Yeah. I admit.
Nice. Very cool. Well, we'll make sure we get that into the show notes. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.
Oh, bye.
Bye.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit